Hello and welcome to the Over and Back Classic NBA podcast. I am Jason Mann, and joining me again is Reinis Lacis of the Handle podcast. This is part 2 of our conversation looking at retired jerseys and reasons behind teams choosing players or omitting players and which players should be considered in the future. So hope you enjoy. Thanks. So next we have the Denver Nuggets. Alex English, David Thompson, Byron Beck, Dan Issel, Dikembe Mutombo, and Coach Doug Moe. Also, Fat Levers, number 12, was retired in December of 2017. And their first number retired was Byron Beck in 1977. This was after he had retired, although not very long after he'd retired. And he was the first player signed by the Nuggets franchise, who were the Rockets at that point. And along with Louis Dampier, he was the only ABA player to remain with the same franchise for the entire existence of the ABA. And he did play one NBA season with the Nuggets. So it was only one of 3 ABA originals, along with Dampier and Freddie Lewis, to also play in the NBA. So it's a lot of plaudits. Not super well known, but it was was a solid player for some good teams. Was known for his hook shot and for stout rebounding. So kind of one of these. Yeah, at that point he had certainly been one of the most important players in franchise's relatively short history. And even though he sort of doesn't stand out as much here, I think it's he was more than a cult favorite. He was actually a very genuinely a good player. It took place during halftime of a Nuggets Bullets game in '77, and then Coach Larry Brown, former player Larry Brown, Carl Shear, the GM, Dan Issel, David Thompson, and the Denver mayor all spoke about Beck's career and presented him with numerous mementos. So.
Yeah, it's like a bit better, although I guess those All-Star teams swing it, but it's like a bit better case than Brad Davis's, but a really similar one, where you were with the franchise from the first year, and obviously the ABA is another wrinkle here, but good. I guess it's good to see a guy who was with the team for a long time to be the first one.
Yeah. And I would say all these guys are fairly fairly deserving. Mutombo, he has the same issue that he has with Atlanta, where he never played for a franchise for that long. He's probably better remember for being with the Nuggets because of being part of the upset of the Sonics in '94. But again, the fame and impact there, I certainly see the case for having him be part of that.
Yeah, I think in a way I almost think it shows how fun Dikembe was and how everybody loved him, because I could imagine that certain other players wouldn't either have the Nuggets jersey or the Hawks one, but he gets both. Yeah, good for him.
Yeah, there aren't really any big omissions. I mean, you could say Bobby Jones or something, but he's he was a good player and part of their late '70s success, including their finals appearance in '76. But the longevity, obviously, is better known for his years in Philly. In terms of guys who coming up who might be honored, Carmelo Anthony, certainly there's a possibility there. Of course, with the way he left, maybe not. Nene is up there in the leaderboards in terms of franchise history and was a good solid player. Maybe not, certainly not a great one, but he has a possibility. The other guy, maybe Chauncey Billups. He wasn't there that long, but given his ties to Denver and things, I could see that being a remote possibility.
And I'd throw in Ralph Simpson as well, because 6 years, 5 of them as an All-Star. I sort of wonder why he didn't get the treatment the Nets gave some of their players, because Byron Beck's the longevity case, and then the Ralph Simpson could have been the first superstar case, because he was carried them throughout those years before David Thompson actually arrived. Yeah,
that's a good point. He didn't immediately come to mind, but he absolutely would be up there as well. It's interesting that he kind of got overlooked in that shuffle. So now we're getting to some teams that have more extensive number of retirements. The Rockets have Yao Ming, Clyde Drexler, Calvin Murphy, Moses Malone, Akeem Olajuwon, and Rudy Tomjanovich. And also Carroll Dawson has his initials CD retired. And he was the Rockets GM from 97 to 2007 before Daryl Morey. He spent 27 years all told with the franchise. He was actually an assistant coach on all 4 Rockets finals teams and was known for working with the big men like obviously Elvin Hayes, Moses Malone, Akeem Olajuwon, Ralph Sampson. And Olajuwon is always credited to him with helping him develop his jump hook. So, and the first number retired was Rudy Tomjanovich in 1982. Soon after he had retired, of course, he spent his entire career with the franchise as a player, and went through the incident with Kermit Washington being punched, and had a it came back from that, and was still had a good career for the rest of his career, and was an excellent player. Now I would say these guys are all pretty much what I would expect in franchise history. There's no one who's up there other than Carroll Dawson, of course, who's like a guy who stands out as being a particular big surprise there.
Yeah, it's almost like they had some very easy choices to make, because they have the absolute best guys who sort of get rewarded for longevity. Rudy Tomjanovich and Calvin Murphy obviously were the duo that brought Houston to some prominence, and even though both had some obstacles, and in Rudy's case obviously that was the punch. Calvin perhaps wasn't as good as a player per se, but he had the novelty about his size, so I think they had some easy choices to make, relatively easy, and they made them all, and it's glad to see those guys up there. And as you mentioned, obviously we don't know that much about Carroll Dawson by not being there, but it seems like he left an imprint there. So yeah, more power to them for recognizing him as well.
Yeah. In terms of omissions, I mean, really the only guy, Elvin Hayes, you could make a case for, and obviously his best years were with the Bullets. He was, with the Rockets early on when they were in San Diego, and then a little bit in Houston. In fact, they moved to Houston because of Elvin Hayes, because of course his ties to the University of Houston, or at least that was a significant part of the reason. And then he came back toward the end of his career, so he had a lot of years with the Rockets, but they were not really the best years of his career. I mean, if you throw in the importance to the area and college and stuff, you could make a case, but really, it seems like it's fine to leave him off. He was honored by the Bullets. That seems more appropriate. On the horizon, I would say James Harden is an obvious. It's going to happen at some point in his career. I mean, he's obviously had great years there. Probably going to win MVP this year, and so forth. So he's obviously seems like a no-brainer unless odd circumstances happen with him.
And I might throw in Robert Reed, who played with Houston for a decade. Probably the second best player in their first finals team, and I think he was the only one to remain for the team in '86. Although Alan Level might have been on that team as well.
Yeah, I think those were the only two, but yes. So
yeah, and he took over some of the point guard duties after John Lucas had his relapse, and one of the first point forwards. And it might just be that they're looking for a higher standard, because I don't think Robert Reed was ever the type of player that those guys were. But he might be someone who they could consider, but I guess he's not as glamorous.
Yeah. So some oddness here is the Sonics Thunder franchise, and the Sonics retired 6 numbers and a non-number. Gus Williams, Nate McMillan, Lenny Wilkins, Spencer Haywood, Fred Brown, and Jack Sikma, and then Bob Blackburn, who was their TV play-by-play announcer from 68 to 92, also retired, given a mic listing on jersey. And I didn't realize this until I went through this project, but the Thunder have honored the Sonics retired numbers and have not given any of them out as they've been with the Thunder. And I don't think there's any requirement that they do that, and it's sort of odd given that they really have for obvious reasons have not really honored the team's history, but for whatever reason they've kept that going.
Yeah, it is an awkward one, and I think the hope is that if Seattle does eventually get their team, that they will get their history from the Thunder, like the Hornets did with New Orleans, where they get their numbers back and get their history back, and that sort of those numbers find their place in Seattle. Hopefully they get the team though.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the first number retired was Lenny Wilkens, who was given it in October of '79. That was the year after they had gone to the finals with Wilkens as their coach. And they would win the championship in '79. Gus Williams actually wasn't retired until 2004, which is a little surprising. And Haywood wasn't retired until 2007, which is even more surprising. And I guess in some respect, his timing was lucky because that was just before the team. They had been sold, but it was before the team. It was known that they were, planning to move. So that probably would not have happened, much later. So he was fortunate there, and actually was it happened just after the death of Dennis Johnson, who also wore 24 with the Sonics. I'm actually slightly surprised they didn't retire, both of them together, given their importance in franchise history. So, and Haywood obviously being the first star with the team.
And in a way, I'd even say that the Lenny Wilkens one is one that probably set a precedent, because when have you heard of a coach, getting his number retired after he won the title? I obviously the days he spent as a player in Seattle add a added bonus to make that happen. But still, I wonder how the team felt about that, because there certainly were some clashes in the locker room after their title. But a unique case.
Yeah, you're right. That didn't occur to me, but that maybe that added a little bit of I wonder the fact that Lenny was a player there, if that added some because usually when there are conflicts between a coach and a player, there's a certain amount. I think most fans are probably going to side with the player to a certain extent, or at least there's going to be kind of it's a different vibe when the coach was also one of the better players in franchise history. That is kind of a different dynamic in between player and coach, I think, and maybe that fueled some of the feelings there.
Yeah, and I have to assume, I don't know, maybe it's some interesting reading for the future, but I have to assume that people were on Lenny's side rather than, the young and quote unquote, I guess they probably were considered spoiled superstars. Obviously Gus sat out a season soon after that, and then Dennis was on the move, and tempers were flaring all over the place.
Yeah. So in terms of omissions, I mean, obviously Gary Payton and Sean Kemp are pretty obvious. In particular Payton, they're hopefully if Seattle can get a team and they can get their due recognition, I would say Detlef Schrempf also has a case for that in terms of Sonics. And in terms of Thunder, on the horizon someday, I mean, Russell Westbrook is definitely a no-brainer. I'm assuming Kevin Durant will someday be honored as well, despite the feelings that are there. I'm sure at some point those will likely be thought over, and he will probably get his number retired. Although they did actually issue it to PJ Dozier this year, so they have not kept it out of circulation. So which is kind of interesting. And then I could see sort of similar to Udonis Haslem, Nick Collison, perhaps. That's I'm not sure if they would do that, but in terms of original Oklahoma City Thunder type thing, I would say Collison, you could see that happening.
Yeah, I think they value him that way, and I think the question will be whether you retire his jersey the first, as the Brad Davis case, or do you wait for Russell Westbrook to end his career?
Yeah, and I guess having to make the decision on retiring it, you kind of have to make the decision on whether you continue to honor the Sonics numbers or not. I wonder if those things have to go hand in hand. I mean, I guess not necessarily, but it does add to the awkwardness if the Thunder retire a number and then you have all these numbers that you're not using but are up in your rafters. So
right. Well, at least in Collison's case, he probably lands in Oklahoma City because that split happened pretty early on in his career.
Well, right. Yeah, exactly. So the Cavs are next, and they have 7 numbers retired. Bingo Smith, Zydrunas Ilgauskas, Larry Nance, Mark Price, Austin Carr, Nate Thurmond, and Brad Daugherty. Joe Tate has a microphone retired as well. He was a radio broadcaster from 1971 to 2011. Their first number retired was Nate Thurmond in December of 1977. He'd only played with the Cavs for 2 seasons, but was a Akron legend. Played for Bowling Green, which is in Ohio on the other side of it's like an hour and a half from Cleveland, and was a major part of the miracle at Ridgefield 76 team that made it to the conference finals that year and were big surprise. So there was more going on. Obviously, all-time legend as well. Future Hall of Famer. So there was more going on there, but that obviously is one that definitely breaks your longevity rule for sure.
Yeah, and that's probably the shortest stint a player ever had for a team, only for to get his jersey retired later on. I can't think of anyone else, at least in this regard, because 2 seasons, that's quite a short stint.
Yeah, definitely. That one's a little bit that's definitely short. And yeah, I mean, I don't, again, it's not like I have a problem with it or anything. I mean, like I said, I find it less weird than I find Orlando not retiring anyone's number, I guess. So. Oh
yeah, and I probably Nate Thurman's overall greatness, helped them make that choice, because it's not like the guy isn't deserving of recognition, even if it didn't exactly happen in your own city.
Maybe, I don't know, the name that kind of stands out here is a little bit odd, is Bingo Smith, who was he was the second number retired. It was December of 79, and actually they retired his jersey just over a month after they traded him to San Diego. But he was the Cavalier who was on the original team and lasted the longest with the franchise. And a lot of teams in the 70s did this, and we saw the Mavericks did it with Brad Davis, where they would retire the player who lasted longest with the franchise. That was kind of a thing that was sort of a trend in jersey retirements in the 70s, and they kind of started to amp up, I would say, in the late 70s. That was when they started to kind of happen more frequently. They had happened a handful of times in the 60s, but really it was mostly the Celtics who did that, and maybe a couple other teams. It wasn't really a huge trend until the late 70s, early 80s, where the NBA had kind of had enough history behind it where it kind of made sense for some of this stuff to start happening, and some of these teams just wanted to I put a number up there just to kind of honor their early history.
Yeah, and this is as you said, this is right around the time when Elvin Hayes gets his. I'm blanking on another name who got his in 79 when he was traded away from his team. But another player who got to play in his own retirement ceremony.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's an odd one too. Yeah, one of the few cases is we talked about there. In terms of omissions, I mean, Hot Rod Williams kind of stands out as he was a pretty important part of those Cavs teams, along with Price and Doherty and Nance. It's not like it's absolutely egregious. I mean, I wouldn't say he has to be on there or anything, but he, is kind of the one guy who I would say would be, would be on there. I believe Walt Frazier was the other one. He was October of 79 that his jersey was retired. So after he had gone to the was that after he retired? No, he was on the Cavaliers at that point because he retired.
Right.
I think in after the 80 season. So. Anyway, yeah, I don't know, but yeah, he's definitely not one you have to retire. But he's kind of like why is his not retired as opposed to the other guys? It's a reasonable question. But in terms of on the horizon, I mean, obviously LeBron James, his number is going to be retired at some point. And you might think Kevin Love would be would stand out as an option. Kyrie Irving perhaps, although obviously he left the team recently. We'll see how feelings go with that, and what he kind of accomplishes with the Celtics. Anderson Varejao would be the other guy who had a lot of longevity and had some pretty strong years for the for the first Cavs go around with LeBron, although obviously injuries shortened his impact. So he's again a possibility. Was kind of a cult favorite, but I would say is a remote possibility.
Yeah, and I hope they do Varejao, because he's one of those all hard guys who made a lot out of nothing. And I don't know whether it's my age, but it might be similar with Hot Rod, because maybe he was also someone who was viewed that way back then. But too bad his name is synonymous with the 90s and the influx of cash, which was then given in large contracts to all players. But because he was a good center otherwise. But yeah, that contract of his comes to my mind when I hear of his name.
Yeah, definitely. So next is the Bucks. They have retired 8 numbers: Oscar Robertson, Junior Bridgman, Sidney Moncrief, Bob Dandridge, John McLaughlin, Bob Lanier, Brian Winters, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Their first was Oscar Robertson in 74. Surprisingly, Bob Dandridge's number was not retired until 2015. I have no idea what that was about, but that's sort of a odd situation. And the Bucks, I would say, are the team that has had the oddest jersey retirements in terms of who they have chosen and who they have omitted. I mean, obviously, I would say Oscar, Kareem, and Bob Dandridge are sort of no-brainers. Were the most important players of the best years in franchise history. I would say Moncrief as well, given what he meant with the '80s. The other guys, I mean, Lanier's obviously a Hall of Famer, but was more of a role player with those teams. And then we'll dig into the other guys, but McLaughlin, again, kind of had this original Milwaukee Buck thing. He and he was also the leading scorer on the inaugural Bucks team and was the first player to represent them in the All-Star game. And then later on, he's been a broadcaster for the team for almost 40 years, so has been part of that. But he was retired in '76. But was a one-time All-Star, so he certainly was a decent player, but sort of an odd. I guess at the time it's less of an odd choice because of this idea of retiring that original player. Then Brian Winters was a little bit better of a player than I remembered, was a two-time All-Star, retired his jersey in '83, and he was retired in a season after he had suffered from back and other injuries. So, it was during a time in which they'd had several years of success, falling short of making the finals, but obviously had some of their great teams in their early '80s. But maybe because his success was cut short, maybe that was part of the motivation in honoring him there. But and then Junior Bridgman, who had 10 seasons and 2 stints in Milwaukee, was a sixth man. There was consistently, despite coming off the bench, he scored double figures for 8 straight seasons, and and then he'd also, at the time, he had played more when he was retired. He had played more games with the Bucks than any other team in its history. Was another guy who suffered a serious injury and then was retired after that. But you look at those 3 guys and you're like, okay, yeah, they all certainly have cases and strong. But you look at the guys who have been omitted, like Terry Cummings, who was 2-time All-NBA, Marcus Johnson, 4-time All-Star, 3-time All-NBA, averaged 21 points in 7 seasons. And then guys who are less of a case, but I still think, are maybe even better case than the 3 guys who did retire, Michael Redd, Glenn Robinson, and Paul Pressey. It's just sort of it's a very odd hodgepodge of who they've chosen and who they did not choose.
Yeah, and I wonder where they did indeed draw that line, because I did look up that Herb Kohl bought the team in 1985, so if we look at his, if we figured that his ownership had something to do with it, he basically had one loose end in this regard, because under his ownership they retired Junior Bridgman, the leading game man for the franchise, and that's sort of where it ends, right? The 70s generation has got theirs, and the next teams of Marcus, Terry Cummings, and Paul Pressey didn't. So they have a bit less games, yet they probably were better players. So it's sort of odd how that team didn't get its due.
Yeah, it's really weird. I mean, it's obviously Cummings, was the best player probably on that later, generation of the late '80s Bucks teams. After the big trade, with the Clippers. So honestly, Marcus and Cummings are the two that just I don't quite understand. I mean, those guys seem like no-brainers, even if they don't quite have the same longevity. Although Johnson was there for 7 seasons, so I don't know. Anyway, on the horizon, I mean, the only other guy who I would think would be a possibility, but but it's remote. Hall of Famer Ray Allen. It's a possibility, and then someday I think Giannis Antetokounmpo. I think he's I think that's very likely given the career track that he is on at this point. Given the accolades that he have, I think he is likely to be the next one.
Yeah, well, by the looks of it, by the way they have handled things, he seems like the only very likely one, unless they start to bring the guys back. And Marcus is around. He's returned to announce their games, and they sort of have mended their relationship because he had an ugly exit, and I think he accused the franchise of leaking some material about a drug rehabilitation he had done. So I hope that maybe that's the fact that he's back in town, that might serve as a way to sort of recognize these guys, because it's an odd list when you look at the whole history of the franchise.
Yeah, that's probably that probably has a lot to do with the reason. Now that I think about it, the fact that he's back with the franchise, I think leads to more likelihood that he might get that recognition eventually. Next we have the Spurs, who have 8 numbers retired: Johnny Moore, Avery Johnson, Bruce Bowen, James Silas, Tim Duncan, Sean Elliott, George Gervin, and David Robinson. Their first number retired was actually James Silas in 1984, who was known as Captain Late, was a 2-time All-ABA, and had a really good career, but would have even been better without a knee injury that limited him in his NBA years, although he did help the 79 team to the make it to Game 7 of the Eastern Conference Final and was the top regular season team in terms of SRS that year. So those Spurs teams, had they had some strong teams in the late 70s and the early 80s with Silas and George Gervin and Artis Gilmore eventually. Probably the oddest one for me in terms of a guy I wasn't super familiar with was Johnny Moore, whose jersey was retired in '98. But he spent 9 years with the Spurs. The numbers don't really stand out overall. 9.4 points, 7.4 assists. Never an All-Star, but he did lead the league in assists in '82, along with Gervin and Gilmore. As part of those strong Spurs teams that. In the early 80s. He had a 5-year peak from 82 to 86, was 11.3 points per game, 9.7 assists, and 2.4 steals. So a little better if you look at those peak. And it was cut short because he had a form of meningitis called desert fever that knocked him out for a long time and limited his ability even when he came back. But he had teamed with Alvin Robertson to form the Twin Terrors backcourt. And then did manage to come back and was a role player on the 1990 team with David Robinson, Sean Elliott, and Terry Cummings that had one of the greatest turnarounds in NBA history. So, he was definitely again, a guy that didn't stand out, but when you kind of look at the case, it's you can see why they made that choice.
Yeah, and at the same time, you almost want to look at the better parts of his career and try to, how maybe you can see a case for how he was underrated. But I think at the end of the day, it's just the Spurs way. They take care of their own, and I know George Gervin has talked about the way he appreciates R.C. Buford, Pop, and Peter Holt, that the franchise takes care of their own, and there probably won't be any surprises with the Spurs as long as those people are connected with the team.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and obviously on the horizon, Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili are obviously going to get retired someday. You would assume Kawhi Leonard, assuming things can go well with the rest of his career in the Spurs, if that relationship it continues to be okay. I think that's likely or nearly 100% certain as well.
Yeah, and it would almost be fun to predict who's the next Avery Johnson or the next Johnny Moore, because if Danny Green decides to stick around, because his fate could be determined this season as he has a chance to opt out. Let's say if he stays for another 3-year contract, that would put him at 10 full seasons, and then Patty Mills is also at 7 seasons and is signed for an additional 3. So there probably will be one role player from this last title run where they get to be the next Sean Elliott or the next Avery Johnson, and I think that maybe one of them too could get retired as well. It definitely seems odd now that you talk about them as active players, because who could imagine Patty Mills' jersey on in the rafters? But he's getting there, and if the precedence is there, I don't see any reason why he shouldn't get his jersey retired.
Yeah, that's a weird one, but yeah, you're right. I mean, I think Danny Green. I mean, I guess Patty Mills was on the championship teams as well, but I think of Danny Green as being like a more important part of that title, in 2014. So, but that's interesting to think about. Some of the guys who are going to be honored there. Yeah, I feel like the Spurs are a team that you could say maybe was a little bit aggressive in terms of guys who retired. I mean, Bruce Bowen and Avery Johnson wouldn't necessarily have been retired and for other franchises. And you know, they obviously had important roles on Spurs titles teams and were there for a long time, so I get it. But maybe, you know, when you're in terms of setting precedent, maybe, you know, whether guys on that level get retired in the future will be interesting to see whether, you know, if they continue to do that.
Yeah.
So next is the Knicks, and we have Walt Frazier, Dick Barnett, Dick McGuire, Earl Monroe, Willis Reed, Dave DeBusschere, Bill Bradley, Patrick Ewing, and Red Holzman as 613 retired for a number of wins for the team. So yeah, Dick McGuire and Earl Monroe actually share number 15, although they were retired at different times. The first number retired was Willis Reed in 1976 after his career ended. I guess the biggest surprise here is Dick McGuire to me. His jersey was retired in 92. And the odd thing to me is not necessarily that he got his retired, but that he was chosen and none of the 50s guys, you know, like, you look at Harry Gallatin, Carl Braun, Nat Clifton, Vince Borla, you know, all those guys who they made 3 finals and, you know, were a pretty stout team very early on in the NBA. But McGuire has spent many years as a scout and assistant coach for the Knicks. He also was head coach there in the mid-60s and was there for 53 years all told. So, you know, given that, yeah, that obviously makes more sense to honor him as opposed to the other guys. But yeah, I'm kind of surprised that none of those guys, especially Gallatin, who was, you know, made the All-Star game 7 times, All-NBA twice, and led the Knicks to the finals 3 times. The fact that he hasn't really been honored, it's pretty surprising to me. Makes you wonder if just it was like a weird Ned Irish thing where, yeah, I always feel like whenever I read about Ned Irish, it was just like some like peculiar thing that he didn't like or that he didn't want to do, and maybe he didn't want to retire numbers for some reason.
Yeah, because they definitely have the best chance, and you know, I got on the Hawks franchise for not retiring Cliff Hagan's number, but you know, at least there's the different city factor there, the fact that he played in St. Louis, but the Knicks don't have really any excuses, and it's probably too late for that to change now. But you know, not if you could definitely make the cases for some of those guys, and it's definitely odd.
Yeah, the other odd omission maybe is Bernard King, and I've read, although I guess I can't 100% confirm this, that the Knicks only retire Hall of Famers, and some teams have chosen to do that, which obviously is a way of limiting your options. But he's been inducted in 2013, so there's been enough time certainly to honor him. I wonder if there's an issue that's keeping that from happening. On the horizon, I mean, really only Carmelo Anthony seems like a possibility in terms of guys who have been with the team recently. But yeah, obviously that's sort of, I guess that would be up to be determined whether that is something that would happen. I could see either way, really.
Yeah, it's a tough one in regards to Bernard, because as spectacular as that time was, you know, the playoff run he put together, he only played for 206 games for the Knicks, and it's kind of similar to his Hall of Fame case, because he doesn't have the title or that one team success story, which gives him sort of the benefit of the doubt, because the injuries held him back, but you know, the overall greatness sort of is there only for individual purposes and not for team greatness.
Yeah, definitely. So now we're looking at teams who've retired quite a few numbers. And first we have the Jazz, who have retired number 1 for Frank Layden, of course, their longtime coach and GM. Adrian Dantley, Pete Maravich, Larry Miller, their longtime owner, number 9. John Stockton, Jeff Hornacek, Karl Malone, Darrell Griffith, Mark Eaton, and Hot Rod Huntley has a microphone, and also Jerry Sloan, 1223, for his coaching wins. So the first number retired was well, actually, it was Pete Maravich, who was retired in a ceremony in December of 1985 during a Jazz Rockets team. And that's sort of an interesting one because he's obviously, you know, he was the first player in Jazz franchise history, still the most important player probably in Jazz history at that point, still even in 85. Of course, he barely played in Utah and feuded with management during his time there, so it was sort of odd to have his jersey retired in Utah, but that's kind of what happens sometimes when the team moves. I think it was nice that they honored him. They still wanted to honor him despite all of that. And Frank Layden, he was so he actually retired as coach in December of '88, and his jersey retirement is listed, or it was listed at December of '88, but I'm pretty sure the actual ceremony happened in April of '89, and so it was probably announced when he actually passed the torch to Jerry Sloan. But so that was sort of interesting. Yeah, I don't know. Probably the oddest, most surprising for me would be Darrell Griffith, who was a good player, but maybe a little bit forgotten about with coming largely before the Stockton Malone era.
Yeah, and it's almost odd in a way, because I wonder why Thurl Bailey was left off if guys like Griffith and Hornacek later on did get the honor, because Utah's sort of similar to San Antonio. Maybe it's a step above, but they honored the longevity guys. And Thurl, I think he lives in Utah to this day. He used to be a studio guy, and also had 10 seasons, peak of 16 points per game, and that's pretty much the same deal. So yeah, Darrell Griffith definitely stands out when you think of Thurl Bailey also as a candidate.
Yeah, and he was rookie of the year, and it was a pretty flashy player. He kind of gave the team a spark, after the move to Utah with Maravich leaving and Bernard King going to rehab. He was kind of the star who emerged out of that mess, and led to the Jazz to the playoffs for the first time with Adrian Dantley, Mark Eaton, and Ricky Green. So it was kind of part of that. So I get it. He also set a NBA record with most threes in a season with 91 threes. Different era, of course. But he averaged 21 points per game for his first 5 seasons. Although Advanced Stats did not like him at all. But they didn't care about that then. So he didn't get that stigma. But anyway, he was an interesting guy. Nickname of Dr. Dunkenstein, which is one of my favorite nicknames. So. But in terms of omissions, Andrei Kirilenko kind of stands out as somebody, who maybe you could honor. You look at somebody like Carlos Boozer or Darren Williams. Obviously, the way that Williams left the team, maybe not so much. But Kirilenko obviously was an effective player. Kind of helped kind of bridge the eras for the Jazz. The other guy who sort of stands out, and not really because of it playing for the Jazz, but for Rod Boone for playing with the Utah Stars and being an important part of the city then, and of course being a Jazz announcer for about 27 years. He's seems like someone who I could see them honoring at some point.
Yeah, and as an ABA fan, I'm all for Ron Boone. After all, it's Utah's only pro basketball title, and I think his ties with the Jazz organization sort of work as a nice way to actually do it. I think he deserves it.
So next we have the 76ers, who have 10 jerseys retired. We'll get to that. There's one that's a little bit odd and one non-number. So Moses Malone number 2, Allen Iverson 3, Dolph Schayes 4, Julius Erving, Maurice Cheeks, Wilt Chamberlain, Hal Greer, Bobby Jones, Billy Cunningham, Charles Barkley, and then Dave Zinkoff, who was their longtime public address announcer with a microphone retirement. So it's a little confusing with Moses Malone because they had a tribute night soon after he passed away in 2015 that they had announced that he would retire his number the next season, but they actually haven't done that yet. No one has worn number 2 since he left Philly in '86, and so it hasn't been in circulation. But they have not had a official retirement ceremony yet. The team says they still plan to honor him some way. There's possible a sculpture unveiling or a jersey number retirement, but it's sort of odd that they haven't had that. I can only speculate that maybe there's some connection to Moses Malone Jr.'s lawsuit against James Harden. Maybe they don't want to call attention to that, or maybe there's some unknown issues with the family or something along those lines. But it's sort of odd that they haven't officially had a ceremony yet. Maybe like I said, they're just waiting to give some very special way of honoring him. Maybe a sculpture will be part of it. Maybe they just want to wait on that. But nevertheless, but in any case, it's out of circulation, so it's not as if they're going to be using anytime soon. But so the first numbers that were retired were Hal Greer in November of '76 and Billy Cunningham in December of '76. After both had retired. Actually, Greer had been retired for a couple seasons at this point, just after Cunningham had retired. So of course they were among the great teams from the the '67 team that was won 68 games and such. Chamberlain's number actually wasn't retired until 1991, so waited a while on that one. He was actually retired with the Lakers first in '83. But in terms of surprises for me, the fact that Dolph Schayes wasn't retired until 2016 after he died, his number 4 wasn't retired. He's the only primarily Syracuse player honored, and Nerlens Noel was wearing number 4 at the time. He was allowed to wear it until he was traded to Dallas later on. So, one interesting note is that at some point, and this is according to a list on APBR of retired jerseys, is that Billy Gabor, a very early star with the Syracuse Nationals, his number 7 was retired in 1955, and no one actually wore number 7 for the franchise until 1974. So at some point it must have been forgotten about or what have you. But he was a role player more for the Nats, but he actually was a star at Syracuse University, where his number is also retired. So kind of a unofficial, but it's sort of an interesting fun fact there.
Yeah, and I find it odd that they stopped at Gabor because maybe it was the timing of it all, but there were other guys like Red Kerr who had 9 good years with Syracuse, and again, it's a place where sort of the timing of the franchise moving is something that hurts those players. But also I don't know anything about someone like Billy Gabor, but also a place where perhaps the current franchise could find a way to sort of honor those Syracuse teams.
Yeah, that would be nice. And obviously, honoring Schayes is a big part of that. He's obviously the most important player in franchise history, but there are other guys, Seymour, several, Red Kerr, as you mentioned, those guys were pretty important as well. Other guys who kind of, look at as omissions. Andrew Toney from the 86ers, that's obviously a big one, and he had some big falling out with the team when he dealt with injuries and was unable to come back. Chet Walker, Luke Jackson from the 67 team, and then no one really, on the horizon right now. I mean, obviously somebody like, Embiid or Ben Simmons, you can imagine someday being up there, but there's a long way to go before those guys are really, realistic candidates for that.
Yeah, and it seems like they will have to be Hall of Famers, because Maurice Cheeks is also one with this upcoming class, and it's certainly, we're getting to these franchises where it's very tough competition. These guys have cases that are among the best ones in league history, so it's tough to be I think it will be really tough to be a Sixers retiree in regards to a jersey in these upcoming years.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe just have to retire, process. Just have to have that for the entire team.
And a Sam Hinkie one also won.
Yeah, there you go. So next we have the Kings Royals franchise, and we have Tiny Archibald, Mitch Richmond, Chris Webber. Number 6 for the fans, Bob Davies, Maurice Stokes, Oscar Robertson, Peja Stojakovic, Vlade Divac, Jack Twyman, and Sam Lacey. So a total of 11 numbers. The 6th man was retired after their first season in Sacramento when they, I believe, sold out every game, or most of the games. And this is another franchise where the dates of the jersey retirements are a little murky, although it's more understandable given all the cities that they've been in. I've tried to get as many as possible. So Bob Davies was retired during the 1990 season, a few months before he died, and his number 11 was used by 14 players between 58 and 1990. And he was in Rochester. They, of course, moved to Cincinnati, and then to Kansas City, and then to Sacramento in 85. Nate Archibald was sometime after 1991. Travis Mays wore number 1 and before 2003. It was also worn by Phil Ford, but by nobody else other than that. In terms of Maurice Stokes, got some help from Todd Spear, who's a great NBA historian. His number 12 was retired in the offseason in 1961 at the urging of GM Pepper Watson at the time. Although it was used, his number was used a handful of times from 1972 to 1981, including by JoJo White, although hasn't been used since. Oscar Robertson, his jersey was formally retired in Sacramento in February 2003. Again, Todd Spear, says that his number was retired by the Royals not long after his trade to Milwaukee. It was announced by Joe Axelson, the GM at the time, but there was no ceremony. It was July 7th, 1970. Although, again, his number was used 3 times between 1977 and 1986, including by Brian Taylor. And then Jack Twyman, not sure about the date. It was before 2003. Interestingly enough, no one has used 27 since he retired in 1966. So Cincinnati, Kansas City. Now, 27 isn't that common of a number, but all three cities it wasn't used. Sam Lacey, also not sure what date. It looks like it was after the move to Sacramento in 85, but before 2003, and no one has used 44 with the franchise since he retired in the early 80s. So yeah, those all, again, those are the players who I would expect, to have had their jerseys retired in terms of, in terms of franchise history. I think they've done a pretty good job of representing the franchise. There's no one else out there who's, in terms of guys up there who I don't feel like are deserving of that honor.
Yeah, and this might be the team who has the most current guys who didn't necessarily win a title in that core of Stojakovic, Divac, Weber, and then even Mitch Richmond. I think it probably is a good guess that Sacramento tried to build, its own history because they have so many guys in the rafters who don't necessarily have anything to do with, Sacramento as the city. So they've tried to sort of, represent all of the eras. And I have, I don't have anything against it. I think it's a nice way to do it. And there certainly are a couple of more candidates, but they pretty much have everyone up there.
Yeah, I mean, you could look at like Jerry Lucas, who played with the Royals, of course, in the 60s. Mike Bibby, part of those 2000s teams. And then, probably the most overlooked, and it's obviously been the longest, the 40s and 50s Rochester teams that won the NBL title in 46 and the NBA title in 51 and made a couple other NBL finals. You look at like Bobby Wanzer, Al Servey, Red Holzman, Arnie Rison, all really important players from that team. And this is probably another case where if you just had like a banner honoring the era and putting maybe the top players or the Hall of Famers on it, that would be a nice way to kind of take care of that. And they did a nice thing with Davies already. He was probably the most important player from those teams. But it's a minor quibble. They've done a real nice job of reaching back into their history and honoring the players who for the most part should be honored.
DeMarcus probably isn't happening, I guess.
No, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, maybe things will get better. Yeah, DeMarcus would probably be the only guy of the last 10 years who you would even begin to think about doing it. But obviously, the team's unfortunately been pretty miserable during that time, and he left under not happy circumstances. So that seems kind of less likely. But so now we have the Trailblazers, and if you were on the 77 team, there's a good chance you got your number retired. We have overall we have. Larry Weinberg, the longtime owner, Dave Twardzik, Lionel Hollins, Larry Steele, Maurice Lucas, Clyde Drexler, Bob Gross, Terry Porter, Bill Walton, Lloyd Neal, Jeff Petrie, and Jack Ramsey. So yeah, most of those guys were with the 77 team. And they've retired 10 numbers overall, and honoring 11 people. The number 77 for Jack Ramsey, and Weinberg just has a blank jersey. And Bob Gross and Porter both had number 30, and they were honored 2 days apart in 2008. The first player to have the number retired was Lloyd Neal in 79. He played the first 4 games of that season, but went to the sidelines for good and retired in the midseason because of knee problems. This is actually mentioned in breaks of the game, and he later talked about how he felt really strong pride in being the team's first player to have his number retired. And it was something that meant a lot to him, even though he was more of a role player there, didn't make a whole lot of money as a player, but felt good. Twardzik, Steele, and Petrie were all honored in October of 81, and that would have been I think that would have been the 10-year anniversary of the beginning of the franchise probably. And Petrie, of course, was the rookie of the year that first year, and was they were he was one of the original probably the original Trailblazer. Probably lasted I'm not sure if he lasted the longest or not, but he would have been up there in terms of guys who lasted the longest.
Yeah, and in this case, the Lloyd Neal case screams like they just couldn't wait to honor someone from the team, and it felt like they had the perfect chance, and it almost seems like they do regret it a bit, as bad as it sounds.
Yeah, later on, Harry Glickman, was the GM at the time, who said, there had been some pressure to retire. At that point, Hollins and Gross had not been retired, but he said, I think we've retired too many already. this was after John Paxson was critical that the Blazers did not retire Jim Paxson's number. And he said, and Glickman said, I think we overdid it. We got emotional, retired too many. We should have been more discerning. In retrospect, only two absolutely legitimately should be retired, Petrie and Walton, which interestingly, Lucas was not included on that list, which I think Lucas and Walton would have been the slam dunks for me. I mean, Petrie was good, but, not necessarily. I didn't think he would pass Lucas. I guess maybe he played there longer, but other than that, I didn't really see as strong of a case for him.
Oh yeah, and I hope that Jack Ramsey is a given, because I certainly think he should be up there either way. But it probably was he was probably talking about the players. And also a note to John Paxson: retire your own guys first, because that's certainly a worse case, I think, than Jim Paxson.
Yes. Now this was article from like 91 or 92, so this was a while ago. This was back when John was playing for the Bulls. But yes, that's a fair point. I would say in terms of the only guy who I think of recent vintage who would be up there would be Brandon Roy, who obviously was a great player for a relatively short period of time, but I think under normal circumstances he would be retired. But I don't know if the Blazers, having had retired so many numbers, if there's any reason why they haven't done it for him. Now, no one has worn number 7 since he left, so I don't know if they're saving it for him or if there's any issues with their relationship or what have you. But that would be one that would stand out. And in terms of current players, obviously Damian Lillard, I think at some point will be retired, and then you could definitely make a case for LaMarcus Aldridge, depending on how that relationship goes in the future.
Yeah, and the question is, what would have happened if the 92 team, would have won a title, because that would have meant a whole another bunch of guys who would have felt left out, I imagine, if they didn't get their numbers, from Uncle Cliffy to Jerome Kersey and Kevin Duckworth, and the first two guys, Cliff Robinson and Jerome
Danny
Kersey.
Ainge.
I mean, they wouldn't be even the worst cases, I think, overall, even if they didn't win a title, because it seems like Portland certainly might be holding back a little in these past years.
Yeah, absolutely. They did kind of create a problem for themselves a little bit with those guys, and I can understand at the time, the excitement over it. And so, you want to honor a bunch of guys who are part of your most important team. Like, I definitely understand the wanting to do that, and they won a championship, which is obviously special, and none of the other guys can say that. So, hey, they got the numbers up there. Good for them. So, next we have the Pistons. They have Chauncey Billups, Chuck Daly, who's number 2, Ben Wallace, Joe Dumars, Dennis Rodman, Isaiah Thomas, Vinnie Johnson, Bob Lanier, Dave Bing, Rip Hamilton, Bill Laimbeer, and then for initials they have Jack McCloskey, who was the GM of the 80s Pistons, and William Davidson, who was a longtime owner. Interesting thing is that the Pistons actually retired the numbers of Billups, Wallace, and Rodman while all the jerseys were being used by another player. So eventually the Stanley Johnson switched his number, Greg Monroe left the team, and Reggie Jackson is still using number 1. So interesting tidbit there. Their first number retired was Dave Bing in 83. Lanier's actually wasn't retired until 93, which is a little surprising. I guess when he left, the Pistons wasn't on the best of terms. So in terms of all the guys who they've chosen, I think all those guys seem like fairly good choices. I mean, Vinnie Johnson is kind of the only really more marginal player there, but he was really important for those Bad Boys teams. So I don't think that's that's more understandable than some of the other ones, I think.
Yeah, and it's what happens when you have success during different eras, and I think they got it all right. I mean, Tayshaun's obviously a curious case, and while someone might be underrating defense, when you look at those names, and someone might figure that he's he would certainly stand out as a less celebrated name, but I believe his impact was huge enough, and the team did rely on stifling defense after all. So I think him up there would make it a complete picture, and then all of the main guys from those title teams would be honored then.
Yeah, in terms of omissions, I mean, the big one, and this is just such in the distant past that it's understandable why it didn't happen, but Bobby McDermott, who was a 4-time NBL MVP for the Fort Wayne Pistons in the mid 40s, he was at the time considered the greatest long distance shooter in the history of the game. He led the franchise to 2 titles and 4 finals, and was voted the greatest player of all time in 1946 by NBL coaches, players, and sports editors. And at the time when, of course, the pace was much slower, he was the first player in NBL history to average 20 points per game. So, he definitely, and again, it's because of how distant in the past it happened. It's understandable that it didn't happen, but I mean, he's obviously, up there in the greatest players in the franchise history. Other guys who, you would have interesting cases. Larry Faust, who led the Pistons to the finals twice in the 1950s. George Yardley was also part of those teams and was also the first 2,000-point scorer in NBA history, which is actually the Pistons' first year in Detroit.
Yeah, and in a way, it's almost kind of similar to the Knicks, where I think they might have overlooked their history a bit because there really aren't that great of excuses for those guys not to be up there, I think.
Yeah, I think. I mean, they've already honored a lot of guys, so I get why they're not necessarily anxious to honor others. Again, that might be a nice thing do like a Fort Wayne Pistons banner type thing and have a few guys on it. But like I said, not the biggest omission ever, but it is a little bit. I mean, McDermott obviously has a strong case there. Next we have the Phoenix Suns, who have 10 numbers retired, and then they have 5 others. So quite a few non-players here, and they do something different, which we'll get into in a moment. But I'll name the players first: Dick Van Arsdale, Walter Davis, Kevin Johnson, Dan Marley, Tom Chambers, Alvin Adams, Charles Barkley, Connie Hawkins, Paul Westphal. And then Jerry Colangelo, John McLeod, Joe Prosky, who was a former trainer, Cotton Fitzsimmons, and also Al McCoy was a longtime radio broadcaster on there. And also Steve Nash is on this list, also on there. So 11 numbers. He's not for whatever reason Basketball Reference forgot to add him, but he was inducted as well. So, and yes, the Suns have a Ring of Honor, and they I guess it's a little bit similar to the Magic, but they do retire the numbers as well. Although apparently retired numbers can be reused, although except for 2 exceptions, they have not been. Tom Gugliotta kept number 24 after it was retired for Tom Chambers and kept it for the rest of the time he was with the Suns. And then number 33, Alvin Adams, was retired so that Grant Hill could wear it for a few seasons. But otherwise, they have kept those. They've kept them retired. So, but apparently they have the option to bring them back if they want to, which I guess avoids the number problem. The first number retired was Connie Hawkins in November of '76, soon after he had retired. And the most surprising probably would be Dick Van Arsdale in '77, although he, again, was another one of these original players for the franchise. And he was a 3-time All-Star, so, certainly a solid player of his time. Did anyone who's on the Suns list stand out to you as a surprise or as as an omission?
Well, I think if you put up Larry Nance against them, Tom Chambers, not that he doesn't deserve it, because he did receive 3 All-Star appearances, I think, during that time. I'd have to check, but he was there only for 5 years, so I guess he sort of, if you put up his case against Larry Nance, he seems like a bit of a, he seems like someone who got a lot of done in a short period of time, but hey, he definitely is as good as some of those other names. When Arsdale's case is due to longevity, so I guess that's his contribution to Phoenix's history. But I think if Larry Nance was up there, it would be sort of a situation where everybody who you might think of is in the rafters, but it does seem like an odd omission with all of the other guys up there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Nance definitely, like I said, the time was relatively short. Unfortunately, he's retired with the Cavs, so at least he does have a jersey retirement. But yes, he's a little bit of an omission. But they've retired a lot of guys, so I get it to a certain extent. Yeah. And 2 who stand out on the horizon for me, Amari Stoudemire and Sean Marion, who I think both have strong cases for getting their numbers retired. I would assume that would happen unless there's some personal differences or issues, feuds with Robert Sarver or whatever that are going on that would prevent that. But other than that, I feel like those two are pretty much no-brainers.
Yeah, they should be, and especially if they follow in the traditions of the past numbers, it seems like there is no reason for them not to be.
And we are down to the teams that have retired the most numbers. First, we have the Lakers, and they've retired 2 numbers for Kobe Bryant, 8 and 24, of course, fairly recently. Also have retired Wilt Chamberlain, Elgin Baylor, Gail Goodrich, Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Shaquille O'Neal, James Worthy, Jerry West, Jamal Wilkes, and Chick Hearn. They've given a microphone jersey retirement. And they have a banner for the Minneapolis Lakers Hall of Famers, although those numbers are not officially retired. We'll get to more to that in a minute. But Jim Pollard, Vern Mickelson, Slater Martin, George Mikan, John Kundla, who all make sense and were really important parts of that dynasty. And then Clyde Levalette, who's a little bit of an oddity there because he only played for that team, only played for the dynasty team for 1 season, and wasn't really an important part of that. He was there for a few years, but he was more, he kind of bounced around the league. But he was a Hall of Famer who played for the team, so understandable. Anyway, so yeah, the Lakers in 2002 they put up the banner that it has the names of the players plus the 5 BAA NBA title seasons. They don't include the NBL title season on that banner, but and Mike, and when it was announced, he was very very excited about it. He said it was nice to be part of the Laker family. I've lived long enough to have a full turn, So the Minneapolis players' numbers can still be used. In fact, Mikan's 99 is the only one that hasn't been used again. So it's been unofficially retired, I guess, or taken out of circulation, or just no one wants to wear 99 since Mikan retired in 56.
Yeah, so this is a cool example of to some of the other teams who have similar situations. Say what you want about the Lakers, but they just nail such public appearances, and I think other teams should take note. This is really a great example of how to do that.
So in terms of omissions, really the only guys, they've retired pretty much everyone of consequence. Apparently they have a rule where they only retire Hall of Famers, and I guess Kobe, of course, will be one, so they just decided to do it early. Byron Scott, Michael Cooper obviously were part of the Showtime Lakers teams and, were there for a long time, especially Cooper, and neither one's a Hall of Famer, but you for most other franchises, you would definitely say those are guys who would probably have gotten their jerseys retired, but because of the Lakers having so many and having sustained excellence, that didn't happen. The first numbers were retired. Actually, they waited until 1983. Jack Kent Cook, not a big fan of retiring numbers, but Jerry Buss did it for Wilt, for Chamberlain, West, and Baylor, all on the same day, November 9th, 1983, 11 years after that championship season. On the horizon, really the only guy I would say, who's played there, obviously they haven't been very good for the last 5 years. Before then, of course, the 2 title teams, I would say Pau Gasol has a solid chance of getting his number retired. I think he's definitely going to be a Hall of Famer, so whether they want to include him or not, I think it would be good to include him, but I guess that's we'll see if that happens.
Yeah, and I think the case here is that they value titles over longevity. It probably would have been an unpopular choice not to retire someone like Shaq or someone like Wilt, but I certainly hope that Pau can follow their lead and then get the same honor, because on paper he has similar successes as a Lakers center.
Yeah, right. And obviously he's not quite at the level of those players, but he was very, very good for quite a while. Then was a really important part of those teams. So yeah, I think he definitely would merit that choice. We'll see if that actually happens. And no one has worn his jersey since he left in 2014. So perhaps they're saving it for him.
And I think the truth is probably that if Kobe wants it to happen, then it will happen. So I think his so-called friendship, which seems more like a case of Stockholm syndrome, that it might help out and then land him that jersey.
Hey, maybe Kobe pitching for him will be worth all those years of torment.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So last so it's definitely by far the most numbers retired at 22. In fact, the Boston Celtics. We have Robert Parrish, former owner Walter Brown, Red Auerbach, Dennis Johnson, Bill Russell, JoJo White, Bob Cousy, Tom Heinsohn, Tom Sanders, John Havlicek, Dave Cowens, Don Nelson, Bill Sharman, Ed McCauley, Frank Ramsey, Sam Jones, Casey Jones, Cedric Maxwell, Kevin McHale, Larry Bird, Reggie Lewis, and then non-numbers, but still up there, Jim Luskadoff, who's great enforcer of the 50s and 60s teams, and Johnny Most, the longtime announcer. And then also Paul Pierce was retired this season as well. So yeah, that's a lot of numbers.
Yeah, and I had never done this task, which is look at the current team numbers and see how they had to be selected. And it's really fascinating because starting with Jaylen Brown at number 7 and then ending with Abdel Nader at 28, there isn't a number you can basically choose on the team. It's either rocked by a retired player or the rest have been picked up by current guys, and it really shows how there isn't any more numbers basically left. Almost nothing's available up to number 28, which are the most conventional numbers, I guess. And Jason Tatum has number 0, and only number 4 and number 5 are open for takers, and then we go on that whole ride. And I think we'll get to someone who might occupy number 5 as well soon enough.
Right. Yeah. That's an excellent point. Yeah. Right. I mean, there is a legitimate, now I don't know how much of a problem it is. I mean, I've doing some of the research. I've read I've read a lot of fan posts and some people who are like, oh, we've retired so many what do we do about the problem? We need to unretire some of these, or players aren't going to want to come to Boston if they can't get their number, which I don't think is going to be is going to be a huge deal, but yeah, who knows? The first number retired actually was Bob Cousy and Ed McCauley, who was October 26th, 1963, though it's mistakenly listed often as October 16th, but it was the 26th against the Bullets. And I guess they were the first to be retired. I mean, we not counting Billy Gabor, and maybe there were other guys in the 50s that didn't last, but in terms of numbers that are still recognized today, I believe Cousy and McCauley were the first to get their numbers retired. And Jim Luskadoff, who is kind of maybe the most surprising on this list, though he was part of a team that won 7 championships. I don't know if you're on a team that wins 7 championships. I think raising your jersey, no matter how marginal a player you are, for that is worth having. But he actually asked that his jersey number not be retired so that a future Celtic could wear it. And in fact, his 18 was later retired because of Dave Collins. So, but his jersey was retired in 1973. Perhaps the most infamous jersey retirement for the Celtics was Bill Russell, who essentially got his number retired against his will. Red Auerbach. There's a great oral history of it in the Boston Globe by Adam Himmelsbach, and wrote that Auerbach knew that he was not going to be able to get Russell to get to Boston to be honored, so that when he was working there for ABC as a commentator, he decided he would just go through the ceremony and against Russell's wishes. So eventually they came to a compromise where Russell said that he would do it in front of his teammates before the game, but not in a public ceremony. So, and it was kind of a surprise. There was just there were some players shooting baskets to warm up as it happened. It was kind of a rush, and there were some of his former teammates, or a handful of writers, ushers, vendors, and ABC people there, but that was about it. And So, although Havlicek said it was kind of nice, there was some solitude with not that many people around. We were able to reflect on each other and look Bill in the eye and say, "Great job, we're proud of you." So, eventually, Russell did agree to get his number rededicated at the Fleet Center in 1999, and then the money went to the National Mentoring Partnership, which is one of the charities that he is part of. And there was a 3-hour ceremony. Will Chamberlain was there, Kareem was there, Oscar Robertson, Bill Cosby was the MC of that. So there was he was touched by that honor, and obviously his feelings changed from with the fans during that time. But it's sort of interesting to it's a kind of a funny story of how it happened the first time.
Yeah, and I guess there's something to what Havlicek said about the solitude of the event, but I also wonder who was the most random person, being a witness to such a historic event, because I assume that some of the road players could be practicing at that particular point, warming up. So maybe some 7-footer was bricking free throws right as Bill Russell's jersey was retired, and the ushers also were around for that. So yeah, it almost seems like there could have been an oral history about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, obviously with so many retires, there are not that many omissions. I mean, you look at somebody like Paul Silas or Bailey Howell, who were, important part of championship teams, but, had relatively short longevity, especially considering, the other guys that were honored. I mean, I would say, for other franchises, they might be retired, but for the Celtics, obviously don't quite make the cut. In terms of on the horizon, as you allude to, Kevin Garnett, I think, is very likely to get his number retired. I think Ray Allen or Rajon Rondo are interesting cases there. I think are maybe Rondo is more likely than Allen. I'm not really sure, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see what they decide to do there.
Yeah, and Danny Ainge is probably a good one as well, due to the fact that he has sort of the lifetime achievement one, where he has done multiple things for the franchise, and I think he after he steps down and isn't connected with the franchise anymore, where it isn't a self-serving thing, I think he might deserve that honor as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's definitely a possibility. I mean, I definitely think he would merit it. Yeah, it seems like kind of something that he might not do while he's GM, because obviously, that's kind of self-serving. But maybe after he's done, I think there's definitely some case to be made there. So
also, no love for the honorary 2005 Atlanta Hawks member Antoine Walker.
Oh, well, I would love it. I mean, I would personally, I would think, I think the Hawks should probably retire his number, to be honest. But no, but yes, I'm not quite going to, quite merit that, despite my love for Antoine. Probably not going to make it, unfortunately.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you, Reinis. We spent quite a bit of time on this. Definitely going to be a two-parter, but thanks everyone for checking us out. Everyone should definitely check out the handle. Reinis has had some really awesome guests from especially from the 70s, some great ABA guests and some really interesting history there. He's really found some gems. The interviews are always really insightful, and highly recommend checking it out, as well as his YouTube channel at Lamarmatic. It's some great highlights of NBA history. Do a really nice job of bringing some stuff out there and doing some really good stuff.
Yeah, well, thanks for plugging that, and yeah, there are some reasons why it has been a bit of an emptier year for me, but there still are interviews, once a month for the Handle podcast, and people could also look up the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar Skyhook project we did at bballbreakdown.com if they are interested. We analyzed the data behind each single skyhook that Kareem took during the 1983 playoffs, so that was something where at least I did spend some time during this particular NBA season in regards to NBA history.
Yeah, I'll include a link to that one as well. Thank you for reminding me about that. Yeah, that was some great stuff as well. So thanks, everyone, for checking us out. You can find us at fansided.com, at the step back at fansided.com. And we're also on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you listen to your podcasts. And you can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Over and Back NBA. So thanks for listening, and we'll be back again soon.